Welcome back. This time we're taking a deeper and spoiler-filled look at Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. So consider that your spoiler warning. If you haven't seen Rogue One yet, I'd recommend you stop now and check out my spoiler-free review, and then go see the movie, because as you'll find out in that video, I really loved Rogue One. Since filming my spoiler-free review, I've gone and seen the movie a second time, and I still love it just as much. I've also come to realize that I seem to be above the curve in my opinion of this movie, just like I was pretty much below the curve when it came to The Force Awakens, a film that I enjoyed and found entertaining, but really did not like the story. And while it topped a lot of people's best filmed lists of 2015, it didn't even make my top 10. Settling for an honorable mention because, frankly, it was still so much better than the prequels. As far as Rogue One, right now it's in my top 2 for 2016. And since I have heard some of the complaints other people have about the film, I want to address those first before I go into all the things that I really like about it. And yes, some of those are the same complaints that I mentioned in my review. Number 1 is the first act pacing, which I will freely admit is a bit choppy. Although I found that it worked a lot better in my second viewing. The movie opens with a sort of prologue as we meet Jyn Erso as a young girl when Krennic, the developer of the Death Star, comes for her father. In the ensuing encounter, her mother is killed, her father is taken, and she hides away until she's found by Saw Gerrera. This scene in itself works pretty well because it sets up the stakes, sets up some of the characters, especially Jyn and Galen, while also giving us a glimpse of a saner Saw Gerrera. And I have to say, I didn't know that Saw Gerrera was from the Clone Wars cartoon because I've never actually gotten around to watching it. I want to, it's just one of the many shows that I just have not had time to see. But again, I thought this scene worked. It had time to develop and have its own story. From there, however, we go through a lot of planet hopping as the film sets up its primary locations and characters. And this is definitely where it gets pretty choppy. Because in a matter of minutes, we go to Jyn as an adult waking up from her dream, as the prologue is sort of a dream, a flashback, memory, whatever you want to call it. From there we go to the trading outpost where we first meet Cassian as he meets with the spy and who he promptly kills to make sure that he doesn't get captured by the Empire. It's here that you really have to pay attention to the dialogue to know exactly where we're going next, because they mention Jedha and the pilot, and that's exactly where we go next. We go to Jedha, we see the pilot being brought to Saw Gerrera. This is definitely one of the scenes that worked better in the second viewing because I knew to listen for the dialogue about Jedha, about the pilot, about Galen, and it all made more sense because I knew the characters' names more, I knew the settings' names a lot more than I did in the initial viewing. From there we jump right back to Jyn again at the labor camp where she's promptly rescued / thrown to the ground by Cassian and K2SO. Then it's off to Yavin to the Rebel base where we get some more information about the actual mission that we're going to be following, and then right back to Jedha again. So that's 7 different scenes in a very short amount of time. So yes, I freely admit that the opening of this movie is pretty choppy. Now that being said, I'm not really sure what they could have done better. We have the very good prologue scene. We could have jumped straight from there to the trading outpost, and that would have cut one of the planet hops. But then we wouldn't have gotten the connection of Jyn as a child and Jyn as an adult. And it is an important scene, seeing her as a child and then seeing her directly again, now in prison. It's a jarring moment, and it gives us a good glimpse into her character and makes us wonder what had happened in the 15 years in between. Something we really don't get a lot of information about, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Now, of course, we could have also had Jyn somewhere on one of the other planets that we are already at, and that would have cut down on the jumping, but that would have added some unnecessary coincidences, which is one of my major complaints about The Force Awakens, and something that I felt was not an issue with this film at all, and one of the reasons I really enjoyed it. So again, I will admit there's a lot of choppiness to this, and compounding the matters is the fact that when we do get to Jedha, we have a sort of a mission as far as what Cassian is planning on doing, which is to find the sister of the missing spy. And I have to wonder if the missing spy is the guy that he actually killed. Until I know differently, I'm going to assume it was. The problem is we can kind of get the baby steps of this mission, and pretty much its only purpose is to give Jyn time to be by herself so she can notice Chirrut and Baze, and then we can have the brief conversation afterwards when Cassian tells her that they were guardians of the Kyber Temple, giving both of them a little bit of character background. Unfortunately, that whole plan basically blows up when they get caught in the crossfire of Saw Gerrera's rebels and the Imperial soldiers. The result is a very cool action scene, especially with Chirrut, but it does add to that choppiness feel, because following all of those very quick planet hops, we now have a mission that fails very quickly, then they get captured and they get to the same result anyway. It's just not how they planned, and it felt very abrupt. On its own, it probably wouldn't have been that big a deal, but with the previous planet jumps, it does add to the overall choppiness of the first act. And I forgot to add in the extra cutscene where we see Saw Gerrera torturing Bodhi, trying to make sure that he's not a trap. From there, things tend to slow down a little bit. The whole situation at Saw Gerrera's base does happen pretty quickly. And overall, the plot of this movie, it goes very quickly. There's very little downtime, and that's another complaint that I've heard, and I don't really mind it. But there really is very little downtime in this movie. It's very quick. From Saw Gerrera, we go straight to Eadu and then on to Scarif, with a few extra scenes showing Krennic meeting with Darth Vader and other Imperial officers. So again, I freely admit that the choppiness of the first act is an issue. It's just not one that terribly bothered me, especially on second viewing, because the jumps make a lot more sense because we know the settings, we know the characters, we know why we're going to where we're going when we do. Now, the second big complaint that I keep hearing is the lack of characterization for our main characters. Now, I'll agree to a point, but not as much as I did on the first issue with the choppiness. We do get to know somewhat about these characters. Now, we don't get dossiers, we don't get backgrounds for pretty much anyone other than Jyn, aside from a few random lines. But if we're being honest, look at A New Hope. We really didn't know these characters that well by the end of the movie. Aside from Luke, who, like Jyn, we know more about her backstory than anyone else, everyone else is sort of an archetype. Han was a rogue, he's a wanted man, he's a smuggler. Other than his personality, we really don't know much else about him at the end of the movie. Same could be said for Princess Leia. We know that she's from Alderaan, we know that she's aligned with the Rebellion, and, well, not much else other than, again, personality that we get while watching her. Chewbacca, we don't know anything about in the first movie. Now, could we have learned more about these characters? Sure. Would I have liked to hear that? Yes. I like these characters in this movie. I would have liked to know more. Again, like with the choppiness, I'm not really sure how they could have added additional backstory without it feeling like exposition dumps. But as far as what we do know about our characters in Rogue One, again, we know the most about Jyn. We know that as a child, she was taken in by Saw Gerrera. He basically trained her to be a soldier, to be part of the rebellion, something that she was willingly a part of until she was 16, when he abandoned her because he was afraid that she was going to be used as a hostage. From there to present, we don't really know much other than her rap sheet. She seems disillusioned with the rebellion after being dumped by Saw Gerrera, but she's obviously no fan of the Empire either. And after having had everyone that she's ever cared about taken away from her, either being killed, taken away, or being abandoned by choice, she's grown accustomed to relying on herself. Something we see in her personality, as well as the line that she gives Cassian later on when she talks about how she's used to people leaving when the going gets tough. Speaking of Cassian, we know that he's an operative. We know that he has done very horrible things for the rebellion, both having seen it and from his own dialogue. And I have to say, I think Diego Luna as Cassian may be the best performance of this movie. The subtlety he has when he has to do horrible things, like when he kills the spy at the beginning, there's so much emotion on his face, and there's so many different emotions that flow through his face during that brief moment. Really adds to his character. We also get to see that again when he's struggling over whether to kill Galen. It's less about what he says and even what he does, and more about what's actually on his face. Like most of the characters, we basically get one line of dialogue to give him some backstory, and that's that he's been in the rebellion since he was 6, and then he lost everything. Chirrut and Baze, going back to that line of dialogue during the failed mission in Jedha, we find out that they were guardians of the Kyber Temple, a temple that has basically been destroyed and utterly looted by the Empire, removing their reason for being, essentially. They act a lot like Ronin samurai, people who have spent their entire life living by a code but no longer have a master. Obviously, Chirrut still believes in the Force and is very devout to it. And he gives us a line that tells us a lot about Baze's character while they're imprisoned at Saw Gerrera's camp, where he talks about how Baze was actually the most devout person that he had ever known. And I know we have the whole show versus tell thing, But that one line of dialogue that we're told gives us a kernel, so everything that we see after that point, both in Baze's actions as well as his dialogue, take on deeper meaning. So of course I would have liked to know more about them, about their past. But really, I think we know everything we need to know to understand why they're doing what they're doing in this movie. We don't really need to know what planet they're from, how they became Guardians, if their friends were killed, or anything like that. We get that by how they act. We know bad things have happened to them. They have essentially lost their purpose, and they're given a new one during the course of this movie. Bodhi is probably the one that we get the least information about. We know that he was a cargo pilot. We know that he defected at the behest of Galen. But beyond that, we don't know anything. And really, with any ensemble film, someone's always going to get the shortest straw. And in this case, it was Bodhi. He really does seem to be a very interesting character because he does seem to be very passionate about the rebellion now. And exactly what Galen said or what Bodhi saw to make him believe this is something that we don't get. And that is something that I really wish we had gotten. But since we had another defector in The Force Awakens and we got to see that, I have to wonder whether they were afraid to try to retread the same material and instead just skip it all together and just tell us, yes, he's a defector, and let the acting speak for itself. He really doesn't come into his own until we're already on Scarif, but once that happens, I found myself caring for him just as much as everyone else. And going back to my question about exactly why he defected, his dying words are about Galen, showing just how powerful his feelings were for the man. So of all the things as character-wise we didn't get told in this movie, that's the one thing I really would like to know. I'm curious to see if it's in any cutscenes or possibly in the novelization. And the third issue, and this is one that I brought up myself in my spoiler-free review, is the CG characters, especially Tarkin. Overall, they did a phenomenal job integrating an entirely CG character with real-life actors, although he occasionally falls into the uncanny valley, becoming more distracting than not. But I am glad they included him in there as an extra connection to the original trilogy. The other CG character, of course, is Princess Leia, and she's not there for very long, and frankly, the emotions of that scene overpowered any issues I might have had with the CG. And it's really not that I could really notice that it was CG at that point. It was more the fact that I knew that Carrie Fisher had not filmed those lines 30-something years ago, so I knew it had to be CG. The same with Tarkin. The fourth major complaint I've heard about is the music. This is obviously the first Star Wars film not scored by John Williams, although many of his themes are included in this movie, both in full as well as referenced in other themes. I personally don't believe the music's bad. Is it as iconic as some of the other movies? Not really, but I think it really works for this movie. It's a bit more action-y, a bit more war film feeling. There's just not a new specific theme that we're going to come out of this movie going, oh yeah, that was the theme from Rogue One that I remember. There is a scene, however, that I thought was really benefited by the music, and that is when Jyn and Cassian have to jump onto the data platforms. It's a very fast, heavy beat, and it really did amp up the tension of that scene, especially since we had just experienced our first major character death, K2SO. And finally, while I'm talking about the negative things, the one thing I keep hearing over and over again is the reshoots. Anytime a movie, especially a highly anticipated one, has any kind of reshoots, people lose their stuff. It's insane how just people go, oh my god, the movie's now going to suck. So many movies out there have gone through reshoots and it's worked. Not all of them, but whether it does or not, until we find out for sure what scenes were actually reshot, what scenes were replaced, what scenes were added, there's no way of knowing how the reshoots affected the final product. Basically, every problem people seem to have with this movie, they blame on the reshoots. The lack of characterization, that was because of the reshoots. I don't know how. The choppiness of the first act, reshoots. The ending, which I don't know how anyone can have any complaints about the ending of this movie, the reshoots, that there was a completely new ending. I've done my best not to read much about the film, but I did read an interview with the director who said basically this was always going to be the ending except for the very early drafts when they didn't realize that Disney was going to allow them to kill everybody. I'm sure at some point in time we will find out what the changes were. Until then, stop blaming everything on the reshoots. So that's a bunch about negative things about a movie that I actually really love. So let's get to the positive stuff now. The first is this movie delivered on its promise on giving us an honest-to-God Star Wars war film. This felt like a war film. It felt more mature. It felt more adult. I still think kids are going to be able to enjoy this. It just doesn't pander to them like especially the prequels did. We don't have any Jar Jar Binks characters. We don't have slapstick humor. There is good comic relief, and I'll get into that later, but it's smart comic relief. It's sarcastic comic relief. There's just a feeling permeating this entire film that they were taking this very seriously and willing to go in a slightly darker path. There's a scene I want to mention, and it lasts like 2 seconds, that I think really illustrates my point here. During the space battle over Scarif, when the two Star Destroyers collide, and the one is basically getting decapitated. Anytime we have a scene like that in a Star Wars film, we always cut to explosions inside and people kind of flying through the air. It's a very iconic Star Wars image, and we get that here. Only in this instance, we see one guy flying through the air and he like hits a beam, and I mean, just looks so much more brutal than what we typically get in those scenes. And it just, for me, again, illustrates that they were willing to go further in this movie than we would in the regular saga films. Which brings me to my second positive. Everyone dies. I mean, yeah, it sucked and it was horrible and kind of sad, but they actually had the cojones to kill every main character in this movie. We always sort of knew that that was definitely going to be a high probability because none of these characters were in A New Hope or any of the other movies. But in the back of my mind, I always wondered if they were going to kind of cop out and have them just like go into isolation on some planet and pull a Yoda or a Obi-Wan and just say, oh, I'm done for a few decades. But they didn't. They killed them. And I have to give them respect for that, because it fit the story that they were telling. And what I liked is we got a variety of deaths, like we would in a war movie. We got some heroic deaths, like K2SO and Chirrut. Then others got the sort of fatalistic, I'm going to take out everyone I can before I die moment, like with Baze. And then Bodhi got the anyone can die at any moment, oh crap, they just threw a bomb into the ship death. That was, yes, abrupt, but still felt true to the story they were telling. And finally, Jyn and Cassian essentially just accepted what was going to happen to them. I did have to wonder both times I was watching it whether they could have found a ship in time. Obviously, most of the pads were way too far away for them to reach, but we did see that there were a couple shuttles closer to the tower itself where Krennic landed. Although I would imagine the rubble from the beam hitting the tower probably destroyed those shuttles, or they were taken by fleeing crew members. And seeing them try to escape and fail would have probably been too brutal for this movie. But as sad as Cassian's death was, Jyn was even more so. And possibly the most poignant thing that happened in this movie in a terribly depressing kind of way. Because essentially she was killed by her father's weapon. He went ahead and built it because, as he said, he knew that they would find someone to finish the job and they were a lot closer than they realized. He did what he did so he can implant the flaw that the rebellion would eventually use to destroy it. But I have to wonder what he would have felt if he had known that his own daughter would be one of its victims. Yes, he actually played a very large role in saving the rebellion, knowing that it would always cost him his own life, but not knowing that it would cost his daughter's life as well. And as sad and depressing as it is, it's one of the things I love the most about this movie, because again, they were willing to go there. They were willing to have us know that Galen essentially played a part in his own daughter's death. Well, moving on from the depressing to the geeky, let's talk about all of the connections that Rogue One had with A New Hope specifically. And don't worry, I'm not going to try to make a comprehensive list of all of the cameos and Easter eggs because I'm highly unqualified to do that. But there are quite a few things that I noticed that just made the overall experience of watching this movie that much better. Of course, we have the obvious inclusions of Tarkin, Mon Mothma, and Princess Leia at the end. But there are also cameos including the duo that Luke runs afoul of at Mos Eisley, being the same two that Jyn bumps into in Jedha. And perhaps the biggest surprise, at least for me, were the inclusions of Red Leader and Gold Leader, who were part of the Battle of Scarif here, but also on the attack of the Death Star at the end of A New Hope. And speaking of Red Squad, this is something I didn't pick up myself, but the death of Red 5 during the Battle of Scarif opens up that call sign for Luke, who would take it during the attack on the Death Star. The other big cameos were C-3PO and R2-D2, who we see just before the Rebels launch their own attack on Scarif. And I really enjoyed their inclusion because until we get to the very end of the movie, we don't realize just how closely Rogue One is going to connect to the beginning of A New Hope. And seeing them on Yavin and having C-3PO mention that they're going to Scarif, which we see at the very beginning of A New Hope, was indeed going to be part of this battle. In retrospect, it's pretty obvious, but again, we really didn't know going in just how closely this movie was going to tie to A New Hope, essentially leaving only a few hours between the end of Rogue One and the beginning of A New Hope. If that long. Now, obviously, the other big inclusion was Darth Vader, who we knew was going to be in this movie because he was shown in the trailers. And while some might have wanted more of him, I never really figured he was going to be a major player in this movie. But what we do get is perhaps one of Darth Vader's best scenes ever, and that is his leading the boarding party against the Rebel flagship. And that was truly terrifying. When we think of what Darth Vader can do when he's just, going at it, that is what we think of, and that's something we really haven't gotten too much of, and it is honestly a nice palate cleanser after the horrible way he was introduced at the end of Episode 3. And while we're talking about the connections with A New Hope, we have to mention the fact that they essentially retconned one of the biggest plot holes of A New Hope, and really Star Wars in general. And that was the design flaw in the original Death Star. In this movie, we find out that it was not a design flaw, it was a purposeful defect put into the design by Galen Erso to ensure that the rebellion had a chance to win. As I mentioned earlier, Galen realized that the Emperor was much closer to completing the weapon systems for the Death Star than they even knew. And he knew that even if he refused to work, they would find someone else to complete it. They were that close. So as he states in his message to Jyn, he did the one thing that he could do, and that was to stay on the project and complete it, but do so in a way that creates a flaw that can be exploited by the rebellion, as long as they were able to discover it. And thus, Rogue One does the one thing that none of the prequels, not even The Force Awakens, could do. It's a Star Wars movie that actually improves the original trilogy. It improves the existing canon. And I will state as a fact that that is something that the prequels nor The Force Awakens ever did. And another reason why I really love Rogue One. It has a purpose to exist, beyond telling an entertaining story, which it also does. I also want to briefly talk about the villain, Krennic. He's an interesting character. He's power-hungry, vain, petulant, not exactly high villain material, but that's actually why he's so scary. He's someone, by virtue of helping create the Death Star, has immense power over life and death for thousands and millions of people. And it's obvious through the course of this movie that he cares nothing about the value of life. We see the first hints of that at the very beginning of the movie, right after Galen's wife is killed, and Krennic sends his troopers to find Jyn. We see later in the movie, when Jyn has another dream of her past, that Krennic was over at their house. He knew their family. He even feigns remorse when Galen lies about his wife being dead. But when he sends his troops after Galen's daughter, who he has to know is a daughter, he calls her the child and to find it. He just does not see life like other people do. We see this again later when the Death Star fires on Jedha City, and as everyone is staring at the destruction and death wrought by the machine, the only thing he can say is beautiful. Is he the greatest villain ever? No, but he's a compelling villain because he is someone who has no value over life, who has been given immense power over who lives and who dies. I also want to talk about how the rebellion is portrayed in this movie, because they're not white hat heroes in Rogue One. They are shown as a rebellion, and to be a rebellion, they have to do sometimes horrible things. We find out they have assassins, saboteurs. Basically, they're not at full war with the Empire right now. It's actually something they're trying to avoid, if only to keep their fragile alliance together. But we see this darker nature of the rebellion in what Cassian is forced to do. He kills the spy. He was ordered to kill Jyn's father. And as I mentioned in my spoiler-free review, this is really the first time that we've gotten a good glimpse of the foot soldiers of the rebellion. In A New Hope, Luke essentially joins the rebellion for the final battle. And when we meet them again in Empire Strikes Back, they're all generals. And while the various rebels who join our heroes for the Battle of Scarif are essentially faceless cannon fodder, I still felt more for them than I did for any of the soldiers who accompanied Han and Leia and Luke to infiltrate Endor in Return of the Jedi. And that's because the perspective of this movie has always been on that foot soldier level. And to double back briefly on my discussion of this being a war movie, let me say that the action sequences in this movie are great. And the battles are honestly some of the best of any of the Star Wars movies. Of course, we get the great hand-to-hand action of Chirrut in Jedha City, and some brief blaster action at Eadu. The best of the best, of course, is the Battle of Scarif, which gives us great troops versus troops actions, guerrilla warfare, AT-ATs, aerial battles on land, aerial battles in space. All of it combines together to, again, be probably the best battle since the Battle of Endor. And really the only battle I can think of from any of the movies that comes even close to topping that one. And all of this leads into my next thing, which is the special effects, which are phenomenal in this movie. With the few exceptions of what I've already mentioned, with Tarkin kind of falling into the uncanny valley, I have no complaints about the special effects in this movie. They are nearly flawless. Along the same line, I love how everything in this movie looks lived in. Everything looks dirty. It looks grimy. It looks like we're in the middle of a war. And it just adds to that realism that these movies need to keep everything grounded when we have Jedis and starships and blasters and everything else. And it's something, honestly, that they pretty much forgot about when we were dealing with the prequels. And since I had to mention the prequels, let me also again talk about the comic relief in this movie. It's great. Alan Tudyk as K2SO is probably one of the best things about this movie. There's just so much comedy gold in everything he says. There's just such sarcasm to it. But it's not like he's, oh, I'm a snarky character. No, he is an android who's thinking like an android. He was programmed to be a strategic analyst and is frankly fed up with the humans that he has to serve. Chirrut also has some great lines as well, including my favorite when they black bag him and he goes, "Are you kidding me?" It's such a funny moment. But all of the comedy comes from lines like that or situational things. It's not slapstick. It's not someone being stupid. And it's something I hope Star Wars learns from this and takes to heart in any future movies. And to wrap up, let me just talk briefly about the story. I know this video is probably way too long already, but I just love the story of this movie. I love the main plot. I love the characters. I love the situations. I think it's a great script. It does have some flaws in the first act that honestly don't bother me that much. And frankly, to me, is a huge improvement over what we got in The Force Awakens. I'm sure everyone everywhere is going to compare those two movies. Which do you like more? The Force Awakens, Rogue One. I'm sure there'll be different answers. For me, it's not even a contest. Yes, I enjoyed The Force Awakens. I found it entertaining. I was not a fan of the story. Rogue One, I love. Yes, there are a few flaws. Nothing that I would consider overly critical. And frankly, this is one of my favorite movies of the year. I've seen it twice. It's still one of my favorite movies of the year. I'm most likely going to see it again because I like it that much. Now, if you're still with me after this long diatribe about things that other people were saying about the movie and things that I wanted to say about this movie, what do you want to say about this movie? Do you agree with my points? Did you like it as much as I did? If not, what were your issues? I would like to know. I'm curious. If you liked it as much as I did, let me know that as well. As always, you can subscribe to my channel. Check out some of my other reviews, most of them shorter than this video. And until next time, I'll see you at the movies.